Hi there. Consolidating expertise and leveraging resources across multiple mines and facilities is an attractive proposition. Some mining companies are doing just that with regional operation centers. Here's a conversation I had with Don Leyn to explore this new way of operating. Yeah, so maybe right out of the gate, can you tell us what a rock is?
Wow, what is a rock? Well, as far as I know, it's a geological formation. It's what I learned in school. This is a rock.
Yeah,
Mines use these all the
I'm not sure
time.
that's what we were talking about.
No? Well, okay. Oh, it's a biological formation. Sorry.
Yeah, there we go. That's
Yeah, okay. It's
no,
a
actually, that's
biological
probably
formation.
not close either. Maybe it's
No?
helpful to use the word iROC. I've heard that
Oh,
one as well.
okay. It's a technological marvel, a car from the 80s. We all
Where do you
remember
come up with
this.
this stuff, Don? This is
Well,
impressive.
you said iROC. This is what an iROC is, the International Race of Champions
I
car.
do remember those fine vehicles from my illustrious youth, but those details are a little fuzzy, I'll say. But let's maybe move on to some operational topics here, and tell us a little bit about the operations center, the regional operations centers, and the integrated part of it.
So you want to know about an iROC in the mining industry or any kind of production environment. All right, now I understand. All right. So, an iROC, it's something that's been around for a long time, and they've been segregated to some degree in various industries. We've all had some sort of a control center, whether it's a CAT command control center or a trailer out on a mining operation, or it's some other automated solution, or it's an office that has a few computers sitting around. But it's really starting to get to the point where you need something consolidated, so you can make the iROC the heartbeat of your logistics and processes that are done in the mining environment, for each day of your operation. It can help you control machinery, the rail lines, the trucks, the drill rigs, all the way down to a port solution if you happen to be an iron ore mine. And it can aid you in making your operations safer, more sustainable, and more cost efficient, areas that all the mining operations are really looking for.
Okay. We'll get into the benefits in a second here, but I just want to tease out a little bit more detail around this. So we've all been to mines, right? And we've seen, say, the fleet management center where they're tracking all the vehicles, they're tracking the ore grades and all of that, and you've got screens everywhere at the mine site, right? Obviously, this is kind of a similar type of information environment, but I think it's a little bit different. How is this different from what you see at a mine site?
So this is different because we're taking all of those separate areas where the screens are loaded up, and running. You might get into a room that has one or two screens and someone's monitoring the IT network,
Right.
or the OT network, or someone's monitoring a process control network, or even maybe it's a security aspect of the system. So this is really taking all of that and combining it into a centralized location to allow you to take advantage of all of the workforce and bring them into a place that's comfortable, quiet, and you can manage it and really react well as to what the needs are. So it's a different. It's not, and I say it's not a different mindset. It's just consolidating what we've been doing for years already.
So
Bringing it.
consolidating, talk to me a little bit about that. Like, how many mines are we talking about, or is this just multiple facilities within one mine site? Like, how big does this get?
This could be quite large. When you look at, some of the larger mining operations in the world, this particular image that I have up here happens to be a mining company that's a global mining company. This is one of their facilities down in South America. Can't mention the name on this, but they have locations around the world. And one of their goals is to have regional rocks or a global rock. And so it's going to be a limitation as to the connectivity and the communications between the actual operation and the rock as to what you can do, but you can reach all the way up to global. So you can have, in some instances, where you can have 3 or 4 or 5 or more mine operations running at a single rock.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, talk to me a little bit about the I before we kind of get into the integrated part. When we're talking integrated, what are we integrating? Like how many different functions or what type of functions?
You know, we're integrating a fair amount of functions, and it's really going to be dependent upon what the use case is. What does the mine want to bring into a remote operating center? Do they want to integrate controls of the processing systems? Do they want to integrate, the management of security, gate controls? Excuse me. Do they want to integrate the communications for the fleet management systems? The list can go quite large, and it's really going to be dependent upon the capabilities of that particular location and what they're able to do for communications. You know, you choose a site and you say, this is where I want to have my iROC. And if you have little to poor communications, that's going to really limit what you can do with the integration portion of it, because you can only handle so much based on the communications capabilities of that site.
Okay, so it's dependent on that. So if you had amazing communications, you might be able to do more than if you're struggling to connect reliably with a site. Is that fair to say?
Definitely, which really it gets into some of the key success factors, you know, when you're looking or designing an iROC, is to understand.
Okay, a couple of more things before we get into that, Don. I'm trying to really flesh this out so it makes it easier for us to have the other conversations, right? So could this include, you talked about Cat Command earlier, could this actually include teleremote operators as well? Like, would they be, or is that a different type of center?
It can be included in that. You would most likely have a teleremote desk or a chair. When you look at like a Cat Command seat for dozers or loaders, or excavators, and things along that line, that's generally a seat, a control center where someone's physically sitting on a seat. It could be in the same location. It may be a subset of this location. Again, it's all going to be dependent upon, are the communications capable of supporting the actual use case? Because when you get into applications like that, there are specific requirements you have to meet. Can you run it on layer 3? Probably not. It really depends upon each particular use case and what their requirements are. And they have very specific use case or requirements for the network. So you don't want to overshoot it and think that you automatically can do it and find out later on you don't have that.
Yeah, okay. So I'm really taking you off course here, Don. So my apologies if I completely wrecked your script. But a couple other questions, and actually KJ mentioned a really interesting question too. And we'll get to that in a second. But so you talked about remote operations, teleremote operations. You talked about a lot of the other operations components. I guess another question I would have is, what types of people would we be pulling off site, right? You talked about kind of the operations people that would be typically sitting at desks, so we can move them to a central location. What about experts, like people who are doing the planning, mine planning, all of that type of stuff? Would those people get pulled centrally too, or do those stay on site?
There's a combination. Mine planning personnel generally have to have at some point in time be on site to, understand what's happening actual mine. But a lot of the bulk of the work they can be doing can be done off site. You're going to see more along the lines of operational side. Someone who would sat in an office or in a room at maybe a processing plant. At the mine, and rather than sitting in that room and have multiple sites of those people sitting around the mine operation, you can have it where you're going to have one centralized location, and that one or two or three or four persons can be consolidated to maybe two or one. Right. And then you bring them into that centralized location and allows them to monitor everything, and then it also saves on that cost of sending them out there too, and brings them into the work environment.
Actually, that's a really great segue. I know you had a list of benefits that you wanted to kind of take us through. Talk to me a bit about the benefits of setting up this kind of a regional center.
Of course. So, you're going to have really several key benefits. I mean, improve operational efficiency by consolidating, multiple remote operations. We've discussed that already into a consolidated infrastructure. Improve security by providing a centralized location from which to monitor and manage critical operations in real time. reduce your costs by consolidating multiple remote operations into a single view. I mean, as we already said, that if you're sitting there with multiple locations and you have sort of a remote operation center that's very, very localized, that's a lot of cost factors. So you can bring this into a centralized place. Improve the situational awareness, providing real-time visibility into the status of the critical operations. That's important because you want to be able to react to a situation, and you have someone monitoring all the time in a centralized location. It makes it easier to deploy resources that are necessary to help solve that situation. Improve the communications and collaboration. Augmenter brought up a very good point about collaboration and being able to have a tablet or something along those lines where you can communicate. Well, if you can tie that into an iROC, now you have both in the field and out of the field, people working together and getting real-time communications distributed across the teams for using a common platform. Improve the responsiveness to critical incidents, providing the centralized monitoring, and then meet compliance requirements. That's another important one. Providing centralized location for monitoring and managing critical operations. Compliance is very important, because if you don't have that, you're going to miss out. And it's very difficult in some cases to spread that compliance out across multiple sites.
Interesting. Because you'd have a common view now, right, of all of the different sites, right?
Yes.
That's an interesting benefit for sure. I guess you've listed off a ton of things, and we spent a lot of time kind of defining what an iROC is. Although we had a bit of a rough start, I'll say. But the question I would have, actually, this comes from KJ in the chat, is where do we start? Like, this is a lot of things that could be in there. Obviously, customers aren't going to build this whole thing all at once, or do they? Do they start with a small piece? Is there an anchor piece somewhere?
It can be done all at once, but that's quite a big ask. That's a big lift.
Yeah.
And you really need to truly understand what your needs are. Evaluate your needs. Understand the technology limitations that you may have at the chosen location. But you really need to get the leaders involved. Make sure that the leaders are buying into the solution and understand this is not just a matter of taking a few computers and consolidating them into a single room and they're sharing, you hook them up to 10 different screens and you're done. There's a lot more involved there. And you want to make sure that the leaders understand that there is a process that you'll need to go through to make sure that this works. And they have to have buy-in and acceptance to support the effort, because there will be some expenditures initially to make this happen. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges of a lot of, these iROCs come to set up, is getting the leaders to have clear, expectations of the bottom line impact, position the iROC, make sure they position it with limited authority, insufficient investment. That's one that comes up all the time. And then the lack of priority, making sure they prioritize, the needs and realize what it is. And so you can phase this in. You can start off and say, what's the most important piece? Is it most important for us to do it and bring our control processes into a monitoring center and then start expanding from there?
Right. Okay.
Take your priorities, and each mine is going to have a different priority.
So, you know what? This is really interesting how this ties right back to what Vishal talked right at the beginning of the day, right? Is you have all of these things you could do with an iROC, but that gives you a methodology for actually aligning it with business priorities and what's most important to do, like right now, right? So talk a bit about the success factors. How do they know that this is working? And then we'll talk about some of the challenges.
So they need to make sure that you understand a compelling business case around the value creation of this, and it should elevate the decision-making process. So it integrates input from functions across the value chain, multiple scenarios within the operation. Experts and leaders are currently supporting multiple facilities, so implementing this on iROC, should reduce travel by implementing a single facility, and that's a big cost. I mean, many of the mining operations are remote operations. I've been to over 60 some mines around the world, and I can tell you that I have had to fly into those mines, and because there's no way of driving there, or there's an ice road and you can only a short period of time, and it's so remote, that's a very costly endeavor. So now you can bring them into a single facility. Productivity improvements, when critical resources are co-located. So now the resources are sharing with each other, and they're communicating amongst each other instead of having to be, we have the same resource in multiple locations, and they're not really talking, or they can't communicate as well to share I'm dealing with this scenario. What are you dealing with? How do you handle it? Now they're in a centralized location and they can collaborate. Think of a bullpen type scenario where we're all communicating and talking.
Yeah.
You've seen that. You've walked into some of these and everybody's standing around one desk because we're all trying to collaborate and figure out how to make it work. And then the remote monitoring process parameters, of the operation of the equipment. It can offer improved emergency and incident response. That's a really big factor. And then this will also aid in attracting and nurturing, the best talent in the industry, for long-term drive performance and growth. Let's face facts. A lot of the younger generation, they don't want to go out and work in the mine operation. They want to sit at the chair. They want to be in a comfortable, quiet, clean environment. They want to write code, or they want to do some other things. And that's all. Well,
I'm not in the younger generation. I'd probably rather sign up for sitting in a comfy chair. But
it's interesting enough. There's a lot of people that that would not want to make that change. And
that's fair. That's totally fair.
The isolation of being out in the field and sitting in a chair.
They like that challenge. Yeah, for sure.
Understand the social and environmental and legal impacts, because if you're sitting here meeting your compliance requirements, your legal impacts are being affected. The environmental impact, this is the one that's a big one that people don't realize. If you're having to fly tens and 20s and hundreds of persons to a mine operation where you can bring them into a centralized location, your environmental impact is much less. And then the social aspect of it, it's less stress, it's less, pain or suffering on some of the people.
So this seems like all good news. Like there's got to be some challenges that are keeping us from doing this, or maybe why it hasn't happened before. Why is it happening now? Talk to me a little bit about those challenges.
Let's kind of go to why isn't it happening now as opposed to before. And I think a lot of the before was the level of communications that you could reach out from long distances weren't as capable as they are today. Could you do an iROC 5, 10, 20 years ago? Of course you could. But you're limited on the communications capability. So therefore you were limited on the actual full functionality of what you can do within the iROC. Today, communications have improved tremendously over the years. And so as a result, we can bring more of the functions, more of that integration into the single location, knowing that we have a better way of communicating. And I'm working on a project right now in St. Louis, and we're talking with the customer, and this will be for a CAT command, and they're having some issues. They're going to have some issues thinking that the existing solution is going to be able to support the communication requirements, and it's not going to have. It's going to have an issue if there's a rain day, because of communication technologies that need to work through different environmental situations. So the other challenges are, it's that. Again, I mentioned this, leaders don't set a clear expectation of the bottom line impact. What does this mean to us? How will it affect us?
Okay.
They need to make sure they position the iROC, I mentioned already, about with some authority, to make sure the people understand what they can do. A lack of priority from management, sponsorship, and commitment. Another challenge that comes up. Everybody has a great idea, and executing upon that idea becomes a challenge because they don't prioritize it and understand the full value of it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stakeholders, right? I mean, in the past, every mine has had its own P&L, and a lot of them are still kind of that way, right? The mines really operate independently. And so this is a bit of a departure from that, right? Where you're starting to deal with more shared resources, right? And even the communications bit, I don't think we're totally out of the woods. I mean, I'm coming to you across a Starlink link, and you may have seen me zone out a little while ago for a couple of seconds, right? Because even with these amazing low Earth orbit kind of connections, you're still dealing with these blips, right? And if you're getting that blip in the middle of a tele-remote session, you might, that could be bad, right?
We had a customer that had an iROC that was 67 kilometers away from the mine. And they were running autonomous drills, and they had a similar scenario at another site that was having no issues whatsoever. The only difference between the two was that the one site that was having problems was a remote site, And digging into it and deeper and deeper into it, we found out that they were not able to pass through that connection the proper communication requirements to meet the requirements for that autonomous solution. And when you get into remote control solutions, that's even a heavier lift because the return information, especially for autonomous drills, you've got terrain data that must come off the drills. You've got video that must come off the drills, and people overlook this, and they think that all the technologies that are out there today can work well and support all these needs. So it's really sitting down, understanding all the use cases, and then looking at each one individually and making sure that you hit the mark for their communication requirements. Not everybody has the luxury of running a fiber line all the way out to the site, and so they may have no choice. And you're correct. Your Starlink, I did notice a few at the very beginning. You were kind of, shuddering a bit there, and we were thinking, oh boy, here's the end of this. But
Roland's having a seizure.
Anyways,
yeah, totally. Right. Question. We've got some more questions coming in, and we may have to defer those till after. But I wanted to actually, because we've only got about 5 minutes left here. What I'd like to do is kind of take the audience through kind of steps, some tangible steps as to how do you get to that point of establishing an iROC if you don't have that sort of already established. And then I'd like to actually spend a little bit of time on, okay, so what's Cisco's play in this? Like, why are we even bringing this up here? So let's maybe start with what are kind of the steps that
you got it.
Okay, customers on.
And speaking of technology, you just kind of blipped out there for a second.
Yeah.
First off, evaluate your needs. Understand what your technology limitations are after you've evaluated those needs. Choose the best location that can meet the limitations that you have or exceed them. Determine all the use cases for today and tomorrow. That's purely part of your evaluation of your needs, but don't forget about tomorrow. Dream big. Think about that. Don't assume everybody thinks about today and they forget about tomorrow. I shouldn't say everybody, but a fair amount do. The next thing is to really understand what you're getting yourself into and bring in a partner, bring in Cisco, bring in others to help and engineer a solution. Don't miss out on that. Don't just think it's just a matter of plopping a few pieces of hardware down and it's going to automatically work. You could have power requirements you may not have understood, HVAC requirements, technological requirements. Then design for the worst case scenario. Did you design in redundancy? What if you lost that fiber line that got dug up or something? Do you have a redundant path to support it? Does the requirement, the use cases of the needs, do they require or can they get away without redundancy? If they should not be monitored for a short period of time, whatever that time might be. And then develop your plan of action. Make sure you understand what those steps are and how you can execute upon them. Coordinate all the necessary components. You got to bring in a variety of components. I mean, from computers and monitors and desk and switching and routing and all the different things. It's going to take time to bring all that in, even a building in some case. And then of course you get into the standard things. Take delivery and start the implementation. I can get into the weeds really deep. Do you have a proper RACI plan? Do you have everything you need? And then once you've done all of that and you've got everything figured out, you need to educate the team. Make sure that everybody who is going to be working on this, whether it's from the build up to the operation and this long-term support, make sure everybody is educated and understands, are on the same page. And then once that's all completed, now you can plan for the cutover to make sure that you're ready to move over and migrate. And it's not going to be an overnight thing. It could be several months. I'm aware of one of them taking a little over a year. So planning properly, and then start the process and running your new iROC. So, where does Cisco fit into this? As I mentioned a little bit, switching and routing, we have many tools and software tools that can help you implement a lot of this. And we can really aid in that aspect. And just the fact alone that we have at Cisco some mining expertise and iROC expertise. And remember, when we talk at Cisco, we have validated designs for multiple industries. This is not the only industry that's looking at iROCs. We're doing it in various other industries. We can bring that collaborative experience to this industry to help them make it very successful.
Yeah, that's well said, for sure. I think it would be really cool if you could itemize some of the stuff in a bit of a checklist, right? In terms of what does the mining company actually have to have in place before they can move forward with something like this or invest. Are you gonna, maybe you can summarize some of these notes into the presentation that we post
Definitely,
later
yeah.
on?
I'll drop this into the presentation, so when we share it, it'll all be there for everybody to see.
Okay, that'd be perfect. Yeah, that'd be super helpful.
And then at any time, anybody has any questions, they can come back to us and ask for our
Yeah,
help.
absolutely. And I talked about partners earlier today. We've got a number of really skilled partners too that go much beyond the iROC capabilities that we directly impact, right? I mean, Don talked about the communications infrastructure and the collaboration infrastructure in terms of voice and video, all that sort of thing. Sensor instrumentation, all of that stuff we talked about yesterday. Like there's all of these components kind of feed into this type of a use case, right?
Yep.
And so, so this is a much bigger conversation than even what Cisco brings to the table. And so we recognize that. We work with partners. I mean, and if you're interested in specific partnerships that we have around that, definitely reach out. And I'm.
Uh-oh. There goes that Starlink again. Don't run your iROC on Starlink. Not yet. Are you back, Roland?
I'm back.
We lost
I'm
you there
back.
for a moment.
It's so fortuitous that this all happened during your session, right?
I know. Did you schedule that appropriately? Did you talk to Elon?
This is awesome. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Don. For more information on Cisco and the mining industry, check out cisco.com/go/mining. Take care.